Now, why is he interested in Imam Al-Ghazali? And why does Imam Al-Ghazali find his patronage constructive? The reason is that Imam Al-Ghazali articulates a particular kind of sober, Central Asian, fiqh-based Islam that clearly has more inclusive possibilities and more uniting possibilities than any of the other versions of Islam that were in the marketplace at that time. Imam Al-Ghazali's position is Shafi'i, and it is Ash'ari, broadly Ash'ari, and it is also Sufi. Now, that synthesis was already well established by his time. He didn't show how it was possible to be a Sufi and a Faqih at the same time. Everybody knew that that symbiosis was a natural one. But in the Shafi'i Usul, it was particularly clear that the definition of Sunnah was such as to rule in, rather than rule out, certain novelties that clearly supported the basic needs and presumptions of the religion. Imam Shafi'i says this very clearly in his Risala, that not everything that is classified as a bid'ah is necessarily a bad bid'ah. He makes this distinction, which is fundamental in Shafi'i Usul, between a bid'ah that is positive in that it serves the objectives of the Sharia, and a bid'ah that is negative. Positive bid'ah is one that does not contradict anything that is already known. So if you say, well, I think it's in the interests of the Ummah for us all to pray 6 times a day, that's completely unacceptable. That's a negative bid'ah, because everybody knows that the Sunnah says you pray 5 times a day. However, the Shafi'i Usul allows the introduction of certain methods and practices for the strengthening of Islam that are not there explicitly in the early days. And in this, Shafi'ism is not particularly unusual, because so many of the great disciplines of the religion were not there in the early days. Disciplines without which the religion would now be unworkable. How much tafsir and hadith commentary and usul could we reasonably do if we didn't have a science of Arabic grammar? The Sahaba radiallahu anhum didn't know about the nominative and the accusative and the gerund and the extraordinarily sophisticated terminology that was eventually evolved. The ilm al-nahu was-sarf was not there in the time of the Sahaba, so it is objectively a bid'ah, but nonetheless it's a necessary and a useful bid'ah, and one that is in all but the most purblind circles regarded as positive, inevitable. Similarly, you could say that the term aqidah is a bid'ah in that it doesn't appear in the Quran and the hadith. It's not a Salafi term, if you like. Aqidah is not a Salafi term in that pure literalist sense, but nonetheless it became very clear to the Muslims as heretical sects developed that it was necessary to quarry the doctrinal material presented in the Quran and the Hadith in order to form a coherent theology that could defend itself against the assaults of heretics and skeptics. Similarly, the whole science of Usul al-Fiqh, clearly not known in its developed form to the Sahaba, but absolutely indispensable if the Ummah is to have a coherent and unarguable and consensual method of reaching fatwas. Otherwise, complete chaos will ensue. If everybody works on his own method of understanding the Quran and the Sunnah, then there will be no Sharia. There will be as many Shari'as as there are individual interpreters. So all of this was uncontroversial in Ghazali's day. Everybody knew that the religion had to be codified. But the Shafi'i Usul made this particularly explicit. Now, what this Usul made possible was the inclusion of philosophical styles of theology, the ilm al-kalam. Granted, the Sahaba had not talked about the terminology that's used in the ilm al-kalam, the doctrinal sciences of the Muslims. Nonetheless, by Imam al-Ghazali's time, it was generally accepted that this was the most reliable, uncontroversial way of defining the implications of the Quran and the Hadith. Similarly, this same methodology could provide a generous space for tasawwuf. The word tasawwuf apparently not known explicitly in the time of the first generations of Muslims, but nonetheless, like the majority of other disciplines of Islam, it came to be regarded as indispensable. So what all of this meant for Nizam al-Mulk was that here you had an Islamic agenda that could include rather than exclude. And this was really interesting to politicians such as himself, and also interesting to theologians such as Ghazali, who were deeply concerned with the political and social welfare of the Muslim Ummah. So the two men have a kind of symbiotic relationship, and Imam al-Ghazali is appointed at this very tender age as the leading professor at the Nizamiya College of Baghdad, the star academic institution in the Muslim world of the day. And here he expounds this form of Islam which he hoped would heal the apparently lethal divisions that had crept into the Muslim world, because this synthesis satisfies people who love the scriptures because it's based on the Quran and the Hadith. It also satisfies those who have a need for intellectual formulations of the religion, a need to understand metaphysical implications, and whose questions about the problem of evil, for instance, the nature of the divine knowledge before creation, the implications of the doctrine of resurrection, etc. People inevitably, if they're intelligent, have questions that they want to answer, and the Ilm al-Kalam provides sophisticated answers for those people. Also, this same synthesis could satisfy the spiritual, mystical, devotional craving, so widespread amongst Muslims, because it made generous space for mainstream normative Sharia Sufism. So Imam al-Ghazali's hope was that once this middle ground, generously defined, became widely acceptable and widely followed, then the attraction of the extremes would diminish.